welcome to the Skeptic Track here at DragonCon 2023. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Angie. We have an illustrious panel with us today. To my far left is Kurt Anderson, who is currently getting his PhD in deception. We have Nick Eftimiades, who is, teaching super spydom at University of Pennsylvania.
I'll be professor of Homeland Security at Penn State.
Same thing. Okay, and then Steve Novella, who is a neurologist and clinical professor at Yale University, and Don Prothero, who is our paleontologist, who has flown here for his first DragonCon from California. So y'all welcome our panel. So, let's see. Let's start with you, Kurt. You're currently doing your PhD.
I am
in deception, which is. Did you create this one?
No. What's interesting is they tell us specifically not to say things like that, right? So to some degree, it's the need for accuracy, and for other degree, it's like the universities have a particular image or whatever. So technically, I'm getting a interdisciplinary PhD with a focus in communication studies, and my own personalization of that is social influence and human deception in communication.
Excellent. I forgot to mention that I'm actually a clinical professor of emergency medicine at OSU. Up in Columbus, I got focused on these guys. I know, Steve, you and I kind of share a passion against alternative medicine. Mm-hmm. So I know that you had a kerfuffle at Yale with chiropractors being given access to patients. Can you talk about that?
Well, there's been several, some with chiropractors. Actually, even bigger than that was naturopaths. Who have made tremendous inroads, into different levels of academia. And what I found basically is that and this is still a problem I find within academia, is that they are not aware of and really not interested in pseudoscience, just in general. So, because there's still this, I think, parochial sense that it's somehow beneath them, or it's like not legitimate academically. But what it leaves them vulnerable because they're just very easy to deceive in certain ways. So
too smart for their own good.
Yeah. So I think the most dramatic example was I was on a committee. Basically overseeing a course for the medical students, and at one part of that course was put together by these local naturopaths who have sort of connection with some people at Yale. And I'm
sorry, Steve. Could you define naturopath for me?
Naturopath,
I don't know.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Thank you. So naturopath is a doctor of naturopathy, although they're not real doctors. And it's an alternate pathway of education. They focus on basically anything that doesn't work, right?
I like Harriet Hall's comment on that when what they do that's good is not special, and what they do special is not.
Yeah,
good.
Whatever's what they do that's unique to naturopathy doesn't work, and what they do that works isn't unique to naturopathy. I mean, they might prescribe you vitamins or whatever that may be helpful, but most of their education is like homeopathy and acupuncture, and they have some of their own unique stuff like the water cures and whatever. So it's just basically anything that's offbeat and not science-based. They're very eclectic. They will do anything. As long as it's bullshit, they'll do it. We have actually writing for us at Science-Based Medicine. We have a number of articles written by a former naturopath who went through the education, thought it was real, and then until she got out into practice, until she realized what a scam the whole thing was. Now she's gone through Brett Hermes, very excellent. She's gone through it was really interesting talking to her after she went through graduate education. She's like, holy shit. I realized that my naturopathic education was like at a high school level. Like the science they were teaching us was crap. And she didn't realize that until she went through like a real graduate education. But anyway, they had their own material in this course to teach medical students they market themselves as like health promotion or whatever they think will sell. And everyone had bought it. And I'm like, we can't include this in our course. This is all, pseudoscience and it's nonsense. And none of them had read it. None of them had read the material. And so, and they were like, they had to listen to what I was saying, but I could kind of tell they didn't believe me. Meanwhile, like it was a cardiology section of it. The cardiologist was like quietly just sitting there flipping through it. And he's like, oh my God, it's worse than you're saying.
Yep.
Like he was scandalized, and he admitted to me like, after the meeting we were talking. He was like, I have to admit, I didn't believe you until I read it, and it was much worse than what you were saying. It was all bullshit. It was all just nonsense. And so that killed it, for the time. But it's this never-ending battle to keep that from infiltrating academia.
Have you had any similar situations at Penn? Maybe not with alternative medicine, but with imaginary or non-functional tech?
Only in the student papers, really. No, when I look at skepticism in academia, I think of things like standardization, or maybe the lack thereof. And what that means is that, at least in my world, a professor is sort of afforded complete control over a class. Right? And if you disagree with the professor, hey, professor's picking on me or stuff, well, you know what? You address that after the course is over, and they'll assign another couple of professors to take a look at the course and, debate whether you've been treated fairly or not, those types of things. But in that class, as that's running, the professor has complete autonomy. Now, the good news is that you're not subject to influence from the outside. The bad news is that if the professor is not one that promotes critical thinking, and if the professor is not one that has standards for that and teaches that, what you find is that, and I find this particularly at the undergraduate level, and probably not in math and the hard sciences, but in other fields, that it's really a matter of research and writing and not so much critical thinking, because there are no standards that we apply for that. And so that, as I look out over the academy, I think that's pretty pervasive. At least it seems that way to me. So that I find my graduate students, I actually start with that, with all my graduate classes on how to approach a product with critical thinking and how to extract data and analytical tradecraft and all those types of things. But to me, that's a huge gap. And from what I can see, and I don't have view of all the universities, but it appears fairly common.
So, are there any mechanisms for redress when you do have professors that behave that way?
Oh yeah, which is the majority of professors behave that way, I should tell you.
So no.
Yeah, well, I mean, but you're going back to other professors who do professors hire their own, and I will tell you, I've been on a lot of hiring committees, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. I understand it, but that community will hire, people in that community that they think that they're going to be able to work with and get along with. And what you wind up after a period of time is a very, very select community that hired itself, basically, and perpetuates itself. So, yeah, for lack of a better term, yeah, you get a lot of, so to speak, inbreeding. Yeah, so I don't see a push coming from the outside or any place else that says, wait a minute, what are the standards that you're putting in here for critical thinking and pushback, and how do you deal with a student that disagrees with you? And I'm like, hey, knock it out of the park, kiddo. Let's, tell me where I'm wrong. But most professors don't. They'll stomp you.
No.
And that inbreeding thing. Okay, so I'm doing a PhD now, and I'm already looking towards how to prepare myself to get hired at a university that I'd like to work at. And I had a university I applied for PhD, and I was told off the record, in part, they didn't offer me a big funding package because they were hoping to have me apply to them when I got my PhD, because you're not supposed to hire somebody if you got your PhD there. And so I found that out, and I went, well, wait a second. Like, I'm looking around a lot of colleges, and there's so many people like, well, yeah, I got my degree, at this university where they're working. And so I questioned that, and I was told, like, off the record, that a majority of people that graduate from a college that want to work there will eventually work there. They won't hire you when you get your PhD. You go to another college and they'll hire you right back.
Right. That's
Because
true.
it's what Nick's saying. Like, well, we know how they think because they were here, and they excuse it by going, well, they went and worked in Ohio for a year, so now we'll just hire them back. So, yeah, there are things in place to stop that, but they're readily ignored.
Well, Don, I know that you have published hundreds of articles. Can you talk about the file drawer effect and medicine? I mean, it's a little bit of a switch in.
What do you mean by that?
Well, how studies will sometimes get put into a file drawer if you're not. It ends up selecting for particular outcomes that people are interested in.
I mean, the bigger issue is the scientific literature, especially in fields I deal with. It's just gigantic. I'm sure it's the same in medicine and so on. It's a point where none of us can keep up with it most of the time. And I keep all these various feeds going on my internet that tells me, okay, here's all the latest articles from so and so and so and so. And several people I know on the list server will send a weekly bulletin of all the latest articles published in my field, so I can find a free PDF before I forget it happened. It's more just that deluge of stuff coming in, and what it makes me do actually is pull back a little bit and try not to absorb too much because I can't focus on everything all at the same time. So,
Can I ask a question for my fellow panelists?
Sure.
Do you find that your production for academic journals, because Penn State is big, no, it has to be a referee journal. We want you to publish X amount a year, that type of thing. Do you consider that helpful in sort of the critical thinking process, that review process that you're getting theoretically from your fellow academicians in keeping the industry honest, keeping academia honest and critically thinking? And I honestly don't know how to feel about it.
Well, go ahead, Steve.
I mean, I'm mainly clinical, so I have published some work and collaborated with a lot of colleagues, on clinical research. I find, like in medicine, the peer review process is actually very good in general. I would say you always get some BS, feedback, because sometimes you wonder people like just trying to justify. They're trying to come up with something because that's their job, is to come up with something. But most of the time, it's very good because no paper is perfect. There's always trade-offs. There's always strengths and weaknesses, and when you're publishing a paper, it's not just here's my data, here's what I think about it. It's also like here is the literature review I did before I did the data, and this is the discussion of strength. There's always going to be something they could talk about to try to tighten it up, to say, well, did you consider this? Did you consider this? But how do you justify that conclusion? So it all depends on the quality of the reviewers and how much time they spend doing it. But my general experience has been there is a value added to that process.
Yeah, we're scientists. We need that peer review process to make sure the system is still self-correcting. But it has its ups and downs. I mean, I've had journals couldn't find a good reviewer, and then they sent what reviews they got, and they were either terrible because they didn't do the work or terrible because they overdid it and wasted all my time with stuff that wasn't germane to what I was saying. And you have that problem, especially the more specialized you get. There's nobody out there who can criticize it. Some of the stuff I do I'm the only person in the field that works on them. So they're having a hard time finding reviewers for that. And, there's also this pecking order of journals. So the higher you shoot for the pecking order, the harder you're going to get reviews. And some journals, like one I'm dealing with right now, which is a very high-profile journal, you think, oh, they're rapid publication, they're online only. It's been 9 months of editorial process, and we're still not in production. It's back to reviewer, back to me, back to reviewer, back to me, and then it sits in their desk for 2 weeks, and I heard nothing. And I was amazed. And this is the second time I've dealt with them, and it took 9 months the last time too. So,
can you talk some about predatory journals? I know we see a lot of that in medicine. Do you have that in paleontology?
Well, there's a whole slew of fake journals out there, predatory journals, and once your name is in the published literature, your email address, I should say, that's the more important thing. I will get in my email box every day spam email from this or that predatory journal that sounds legit, but usually published in the underdeveloped world, and they sound legit. And of course, if you're in the field, you know which ones are legit. And they're soliciting for mechanical engineers. They're soliciting for medical articles from me. They have no fine tuning of this broad blast they send out emails to. Every scientist who's on their list gets it, no matter whether you're in the field or not. So if I'm asked about a chemical engineering journal wanting to publish what I'm doing, and I think, What is the point of all this? It's very scary that they're not even more refined than that. So,
should we define a predatory journal for the audience really quickly? I mean, basically, there are some journals out there that are paid to publish, right? So the author gives the journal $200 or $300 to get their paper published in the journal, and which, in and of itself is not bad, because that's, you got to have some business model. Either you sell ads in your journal, or you pay, have the author pay to get published.
or you're part of a society that publishes a journal.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But because of that business model, there are some journals or some companies who own multiple journals. So we're just going to create 100 throwaway journals. We'll publish anything anybody sends us as long as they give us $300. And so it just floods the space, the published literature, with a bunch of very low quality articles. They're not doing real peer review. They're not doing real edited. They've been stung multiple times. People exposing how terrible it is. It doesn't mean all open access or pay to publish journals are fake. Some are good, but they're just unfortunately filling the space with fake journals which publish really terrible articles.
And they're mostly not only the predatory, they're online only, so there's no physical product. They don't actually have any institutional support. They're usually some kind of private enterprise that just hires a few people to put on their masthead. And there's the exposés that have been done about them are really stunning. I mean, one guy sent him an article which was just, do not publish this article or something like that. It was a repeated string, the whole thing. It had no real text in it. And it was published in this journal because they don't have a human read it. It's done machine learning, which wasn't very smart apparently. And the other tricks, like putting in journals articles, are completely fake just to see if it gets past the review process. And of course, since there's no human involved in this, the humans are on the masthead, but that's it. It happens all the time. As long as you pay for it, anything can be published. So the problem where this gets into a problem is that if someone's evaluating you, let's say for promotion or evaluating your professional turnout, they have to know from some source, and there actually are sources online to keep track of these, which journals have credibility and which don't, because there's so much crap out there.
Well, we need, if you're going to have questions, please go up to the mic, because it's being recorded, and we want to hear what you have to say. Please. So you mentioned there's online sources for figuring out the quality of a journal. So that part's true. How do you determine whether or not the impact factor is a real factor, or if it's is it believable?
Well, there are several sort of aggregate things that pile together all the journal articles published and get their selectivity and get the number of people that actually hit on them, because of course it's now counted by number of clicks on the internet that download it. That sort of tracks what's really getting read. And that's pretty much objective. That's stuff that's just straight off of whatever the internet is doing. That's where you get a lot of this sense of how popular an article is. That you can't get a sense of how well regarded in the field by how many clicks it is, because it's often just a flashy title that gets a lot of attention.
So I can tell you at my level, we have a class on business development for PhD students. And one of the things they do is they take you through the various layers of publications. Like, these are level 1 publications in your field. Here's level 2, here's level 3. And then if you're doing spillover into psychology, here's level 1, here's level 2, here's level 3. So you should have proper mentoring along the way that helps you. Right. And then if you find something that doesn't fit, you then should have the skills to look that up. And if you don't, you ask somebody else that does. Okay.
So I guess what was it, 20? You were asking what percentage? Okay. So I'm sorry, I couldn't. What percentage of the
what percentage? If I understood, what percentage of the articles?
Just how big of a problem is it? Is it 1%? Is it 20% of the literature? Is it
if you're looking at open access journals, they're the one big sort of with a sting operation really, but they basically submitted a fake paper to every single open access journal at the time, and I think it was something like 40 to 45% published and easily determined that it's fake article. So that's probably about the magnitude of the problem that we're talking about. About half, are not legitimate.
So I think you're asking what percentage of journals are
Yes, that's
Okay, that's what that
that's
was.
a percentage of journals that accepted this bogus paper
Right.
without enough of an
So
editorial process.
that is a ballpark number for roughly percentage. Basically, as you're trained in a field, you learn from your peers and your mentors what the good journals are, and what the no good journals are if they're around at that time, and then you just try to steer your career so you get the highest profile you can get your paper published in. I mean, some stuff is small scale, small potatoes. You don't try to submit it to Science or Nature, but you have something really good. You try hard to get it into a top tier journal because that's what a lot of people are looking for.
But the big problem is for the lay public, right? Because they don't know what the good journals are,
or journalists in general,
or journalists as well. And so, then there also, it's not just you were talking about the file drawer problem. So there's multiple layers of problems now. One is that researchers are more likely to publish their research if it's positive than negative, right? So that distorts the literature. Researchers are more likely to cite positive papers than negative papers. So there's citation bias. So now you have a web, an interconnected web of articles that are biased towards one outcome rather than reflecting the actual research that's out there. And then you layer on top of that articles in respected journals, which are the most likely articles to get retracted, by the way. The articles that show something new or novel have the highest impact factor, meaning that the most people read and cite them, but also are the most likely to be retracted because they made a mistake or they're just not true.
Or so they make people pay attention, and then they try to go out and debunk it.
Exactly. So, there's some multiple structural problems with the literature. Meaning, if you look at all the studies to try to come to a conclusion about what reality is saying, you need to look at the literature as a whole. But again, there's a lot of things that bias that literature. And so you have to, any systematic reviewer, somebody who's doing a meta-analysis needs to know all of these things. And there are fixes for it. There are statistical ways you can fix publication bias. You can account for citation bias. You can measure these things and include it. If you're not doing all of those things, then your review is of little value. You can't really make conclusions about what the science says unless you know how to adjust for all of these biases in the literature.
They also don't publish reproduced.
They're less likely to publish exact replications because they're not as sexy. But that's what we need. We need lots of replications. That's how we ultimately know what's true and what's not true.
Yeah, it's more often that something makes it big in Science or Nature. Science media picks it up. Giant explosion. This is going to rewrite the textbooks. If you're in the field as long as I have been, 45 years in counting, you keep your pay attention to what's going on. You go to professional meetings. You listen to what they're saying and publishing. Usually within 2 or 3 years, if it's not credible, it's been shot down and never makes a textbook at all, at least not the textbooks I write, and I write quite a few. That is something, unfortunately, that is a big part of it. To get in those top journals, you have to really push the envelope, be flashy, do stuff that's interesting so that science journalists like it, and it gets published. And then, of course, the upshot of it is everyone else is going to pay attention, and they'll try to quickly debunk it if they can, if they think there's a way they can show you wrong. So that's the best example of science correcting itself, which I was talking about yesterday.
Among researchers and academics, it works eventually, but the problem is the media only pays attention to the initial splash and not the never mind.
You never hear the retraction 4 years later. That's right.
So there was a very recent thing written on a superconductor. And this, right? And then it's like huge. And I was reading different forums. And they're like, okay, this can be replicated within days. And you heard all this thing within like 2 weeks. It was like, no, this has been tested and shown this is not going to work. We don't hear that, right? You have to go find that article.
Right.
The cold fusion was a really high-profile example of it, yes, because it was so striking that tons of labs just dropped what they were doing, and they were qualified to really replicate the results, and they just stopped what they're doing and went immediately to that problem. And it was the fastest rebuttal I think had ever happened in science.
And science is actually the easiest, in publications to have follow-on research and to prove and disprove.
Right.
It's a lot murkier when you get to the social sciences.
Right.
Yeah. And Lancet retracted Wakefield's MMR.
Eventually.
But people don't know about it. They just don't know about it. I see we have someone at the microphone.
Yeah.
Don't touch the microphone, please.
Sorry.
It's magic. Magic mic.
The figure you cited earlier of 40% accepted this bogus paper. How do lay people actually protect themselves? Do you have resources that we can like look into, classes we can take for how to become more medically literate, maybe to figure out why these things are bogus, because there's a lot of jargon that's going on, a lot of media that's promoting it. How do we as like normal people figure out what's going on?
There's no easy solution, and there's no hack, that will make you sort through it all. So for any question that you're interested in, that you care about, you have to find reliable sources that that are like they're academic, they're institutional, they're professional. We could trust. I could probably trust this source, and they need to give you some kind of consensus expert review of that question. Where they will sort out for you, like, yeah, these papers are not legitimate. These are the legitimate ones. This is what they say. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is the consensus of expert opinion. Until you get to that level, you don't know. You can't know based upon what the media is telling you. You can't know based upon a single study. A single study could be completely wrong. Most published studies are wrong. That doesn't mean that they're bad. That's just the nature of science. Yeah. Statistically, that's supposed to be the case.
Yeah, right? Make mistakes to learn something.
And this should actually be at the heart of academia, right? You should be able to look in a mentoring way. Your professor should be able to lead people through that, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, there is a website, and I'm blanking out the name of it right now, but this started about 15 years ago when this problem first arose. Some librarian actually conduct a website where he started tracking predatory journals. And I mean, you can just look into Google search for predatory journal list or something like that. It'll come up with one of the main hits. And they're people who you stopped working on?
Yeah, something happened. You had to stop doing it.
Okay, but there's other lists out there, and most of the journals that are now red flagged will probably show up in that list and let you know. So yeah, there are some resources that if you know what to do, you can find it.
All right. Next question.
Continuing in the same vein, do you see a value for having a formal logic class in middle school, high school, college level? There is a college level course, but it's elective for most majors, to teach kids how to tell the difference between fact and opinion, identify logical fallacies, identify manipulation in arguments,
that would be
and so
awesome.
on.
I think I can take this one, guys. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree. There's really does need to be, and some teachers do this. This exists. It needs to be more universal, like just baked into the curriculum. That you need a course on basic, just media savvy, logic, critical thinking, but also that needs to be woven into every science course, not just like. Now we're talking logic, and then the rest of the time it's business as usual. It needs to be fundamental to understanding science. Is this level of critical thinking and how it gets communicated to the public, et cetera. But
it's hard fast because they're pulling many, many, many factors to determine science curriculum, especially testing and all sorts of other stuff. And often the things like the fundamentals of how science works, they're given a cartoonish version of this in week 1 in the science textbook, and then that's all they get.
Right.
And it's tough to put it harder, especially when certain states are trying to inject anti-science into the curriculum. You're battling even a harder battle there. So.
Right, and it really needs to be baked into the curriculum, like you said. I mean, because it is broadly applicable across every topic, and those skills are really translatable to every interaction.
What is the most important skill in our world today? Is the ability to, evaluate information. Right.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
We all have access to it. I mean, there's still a little bit of an information divide, socioeconomically, but I mean, generally speaking, access to information is greater than it's ever been in human history. We all have in our pockets the access to the world's store of knowledge. But
accessible to the internet, whichever you want to call it. Yes,
it's buried in nonsense and bullshit, and you have to be able to figure out what's real and what's not real. There's no skill greater than that. As I like to point out, one of the richest men in the world, Steve Jobs, who had every resource, every access. Arguably, we don't know for sure what would have happened, but arguably died because he couldn't evaluate some basic medical information. And think about that. That's the most ironic fact you can think about in this context.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I'd love to see it done more at the high school or middle school level, but there's a lot of politics and a lot of other things involved. That's one of the advantages of being at the collegiate level, and especially as we were talking about earlier, the independence of faculty in most cases to determine what they teach within bounds, of course. And I've done all my career, I nearly always teach large undergraduate classes. I've only recently actually had any grad students at all. most of my career was sponsored some liberal arts colleges like Occidental and Vassar and Knox College, all which were undergrad only. So I was always doing it with undergrads only, and usually very big classes too. So they're often science survey types courses, and most every one of them I find a way to usually work it in the beginning or somewhere. I work in quite a bit about the nature of science and how to evaluate critical ideas and so on. In some cases, it's because the course itself demands that. One of the first courses I ever created off the top of my head when I taught at Knox College in Illinois was a creation, evolution, and creationism. And I just cooked the whole thing up to make it perfect for what we need to do. And like the first thing we did in the first week and a half was nothing but the nature of science, how critical thinking works, various types of logical fallacies, all that kind of stuff, so that they were all universally had that standard to think about. Then we talked about how science came about evolution, and gave it some time. We didn't actually get to creationism until like week 7. And then the minute they started reading the stuff in the creationism, they could see it. They didn't have to have anyone tell them that this was bullshit. They could see it was bullshit because they had been trained how to think. Excellent. And that was something that was a lot of fun to do. It didn't last too long, but I had a good fun with it.
So you don't feel like that actually set you back in your education because they were fresh from your recent lessons where you taught them what you wanted to?
Well, I wanted them to come away from the class. I'll tell them at the very beginning of the class, I'm not trying to change your religion. This is a very conservative, rural part of Illinois I used to teach in. I don't want to change your religious beliefs. I don't want to change your ideas. I just want you to think about this and just accept that there are other ideas out there and start to broaden your horizons. That's why you're in a liberal arts college. That's your job here, is to learn more about the world than you heard from your parents and your family and your community. And, most of them, embraced that eventually. Some were resistant at first. But, I was really open about it. I was saying, we don't have all the answers. This is not perfect. This is how we think we can best operate, and then build that slowly. So, by the time they run into a booby trap thing like creationism, they're really criticizing it and spotting the problems. And it didn't take very long. I didn't have to tell them much for them to spot it. So
excellent. Hi, Chuck.
Hi, this is for Nick. In your introduction, you talk about well, somebody said bullshit, so I'll say bullshit from your students. So I'm curious: are you still getting things like remote viewing, killing via telepathy, and Colonel Shannon's First Earth Battalion pieces?
That program was real, right?
Right.
You understand that, the First Earth Battalion. Actually, what was his name? Lenny something or other, DIA, 3-star general at the time, oversaw that.
Carrying lambs into battle. Yeah.
This is the men who stare at goats story?
Yeah. I actually, my bosses were part of that program on the human side in DIA, and we were taking it. Everyone had to go. I'm sorry, I'm derailing the question, and I apologize. But
no.
It's important.
Not at all.
Skepticism.
Yeah, so we're getting the review that you have to take annually, on authorities, on intelligence authorities, right? So they fill up the auditorium, you sign in so that they can see that, okay, F. Timiata's signed in, and then, you look and see if there's an exit in the back that no one's watching. I mean, that's sort of what I do. But this case was extraordinary because a guy comes out and says, the history of intelligence is this. And, we thought, gosh, and when did the government get a sense of humor? But he was amazing. As a historian, he really came out and he cited that program and talked about, let's say, some of the abuses, the medical experimentation that CIA did, Army did, gassing of towns, all that type of stuff that we used to do in those days. I, as a human-der, I'm sitting there and my two bosses are in front of me and they go, do you remember that? Johnny got caught between the this is like a psycho door thing, and he got caught between the door. And I'm looking at these two maniacs that are talking about, these programs as if it was just absolute normal life. And I thought, you know what? That after probably 25 years, and I thought, okay, I probably am in a land that's not too normal, for the average citizen. But to answer your question, then it's I would say most of that, we have lots of regulation and in the government that actually translates out even into academia, having to do IRBs and things like that, before you do any work with individuals. I won't call it testing, interviewing and stuff. So there are a lot of parameters and gates that are put on how you work and do research with other people. My students are, I don't get anything crazy out of them, but what I do get is less rigorous than I'd like critical thinking on things. I'll give you. Can I give one example?
Please.
I'll make it 30 seconds. I promise. So a student writes that in making the case on domestic terrorism and how much of a problem it is, it was 2019. She writes that the number of domestic terrorism incidents has doubled over the past year. Okay, and it's a media quote. So I go look up the media quote, and sure, and that's what they say. And it's doubled to 72 cases. Okay, not a heck of a lot, right? 72. And I had counterterrorism in my background for a long time. And of course, doubling, where are all the bodies? And if it's just sticking in my mind, there are no bodies here. What the heck? So I go looking into the data and looking up. Half those cases were fistfights. One of them was a parking lot in Las Vegas, a fight over a parking space. And a guy made threats, and they literally arrested him for domestic terrorism threats. Most of the rest were knifings, and then there were a couple of gun incidents. Even, in fact, you'll see the stats for this year jump up, because you had here in Atlanta the protests over the police, right? So, and I think it was 28, 29 people were arrested for domestic terrorism for throwing bottles and rocks. So it very much depends on definitions, but if you don't do the research and you don't do the critical thinking, you don't know that. So, and it's time consuming, it requires a lot of thought that you put behind it and a lot of inquisitive mind and going back searching those things. So that's, at least from my area, that's what I bout with, and that's what I try and correct. Sorry about the long-windedness.
No, that's fine. Next question.
Thanks for this panel. You had no idea how timely it is for me. So I'm a PhD student at GSU, and I was asked this semester to teach my first class. It is Data Reasoning for the Digital Age. It's essentially skepticism and information literacy. And it was a last-minute development for everybody, but it's going well. It's a good group. However, I would love any tips you have on engaging them, on getting these messages home, especially when it's such a diverse student body from a lot of different backgrounds, and we all have our own biases. And I'll take the answer sitting down. Thanks.
Go Panthers.
So one of the things that works for me personally is to hit them with a few things right out the gate that is hard for them to kind of think about, and then you show. So here's a fun one, right? Not all facts are true, and we're not talking about fake news. Not all facts are true. It's because when we get, like Nick was saying, definitions are so important, in away from academia and away from science, we kind of think of like, well, it's whatever Webster says is the definition. But Nick and I could both be talking about deception and talking about a specific concept, but his lens of that in mind could be different. We could talk right past each other using the same words because...
And we have, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really have.
And the specific definition that he has for it is correct, and so is mine, but they're applied differently because of the science, right? So you say all facts aren't true. So there are things that we believe as factual that have been repeatedly tested that aren't true. We're always dealing with the best wrong answers we have, right? That's science. Perfect example, at one time, testably, the sun rose, went through the sky, and set. And it happened every day, repeatedly tested. And so we knew that the sun revolved around the earth scientifically. That was a fact at one time. We now know that's not true. So there's certain facts that aren't true. And so when you get students starting to think about these things that sound not possible, and then you show how that makes sense, you said you get to that point by reasoning through it. And we're going to do that in this class. And so we're going to show you some things, and you're going to learn some things that, maybe your friends or family think is true, and you're going to be able to show them why it's not. So when you're talking about, getting them to think in this line and that you're going to empower them, it's a great way to connect. So if you want to connect with the students, get them excited about this idea, and a lot of times, showing them using a fact that doesn't sound right, like in the field of deception, most people lie less than the average person. Right?
Stats
Now, see
101.
your reaction right there, right? And I just told you we were going to do this, and still you're like, wait, what? Like, it takes a second for your brain. Most people don't lie very much, but you have a few people that lie a whole lot, and that skews this tail on this study, So and then when you explain the science behind it, your students will start to realize you have to look at these things differently than you're used to, and that's why you're here. So engage them, get them thinking about thinking. Now that's what's worked for me. I'm still fairly new at this. These guys probably have better answers, but that has worked for me so far. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, sure.
Yeah, that's a great approach. I mean, just anything time you workshop it, just you give them a task like, what do you think about this? And there's tons of stuff that most people believe that's wrong. Those are great early targets. Challenging things that they took for granted, their whole life. Sugar makes you hyper. No, it turns out it doesn't. How do we know if it does or not? That whole question of how do we know? How could we know? How would we know? What does the data actually say? And then the headlines are full of, right, it's a target-rich environment, as we'd like to say, right? You can almost tell them to pick anything out and just ask the question, is this true or not? How do we know? What is the evidence? How do we evaluate that evidence? How do we evaluate the conclusions based upon that evidence? And there's countless material out there for that.
Next question.
So I've certainly had the experience of reviewing a manuscript after being contacted by a journal editor, and all the reviewers reject the paper, fundamental flaws, controls missing, that sort of thing, only to be contacted by a journal editor from another journal a few weeks later. The same manuscript comes back, but now there's magically new data, and there wasn't enough time to generate it. Biologically, there wasn't enough time to do the animal studies to do it. So it's like you really scratch your head and say, yeah, this is fraud on the side of the submitter. I think we've generally relied on high-quality editors at reputable journals to contact the experts, the people in the field that know the area, to review manuscripts. One of the things I've seen in recent years is that whole process has generally been anonymous. The editor knows who the reviewers are. The authors don't always know. Yeah. But I've seen more and more journals now asking the reviewers, is it okay if we put your name associated with the manuscript that's being published, so that everybody knows who reviewed it? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that will help reduce the occurrence of fraud, or just the publication of bad information?
I've run into that a lot, and the big thing is, there are people who are, your enemies in the field. There are people who just simply reject your basic training and your basic assumptions, and you have to be trusting the editor not to, abuse you by giving you people who are not going to give you a fair review. But then anonymity protects them, and sometimes it doesn't really work very well for that reason. But on the other hand, the reviewer may not really want to say what they should say if they're being outed. So I'm not thinking it's a simpler answer. I think the solution that's currently in place is that the editorial board will offer you the opportunity to reveal your identity to the authors if you choose, and you can still remain anonymous. That's probably the only compromise that'll work. But in answer to your previous part that you were talking about there, most journals now, especially the reputable ones, have these disclaimers. I mean, to finish filing everything and send it to the journal and submit it, there's disclaimers about everything. Where's your funding sources? All these other stuff. And there's always a disclaimer, has this work been submitted someplace else recently? And that's supposed to be in there, I think, now for most journals, so that, because the editor won't know this. And, if someone's playing a game where they've got it on multiple journals to see which one goes bingo first, that's playing the game. That's fraud.
Yeah, it is. But, on the other hand, the time frames it takes journals to get back to you
is
just,
a big problem.
By the time, I don't typically publish in academic journals, even though my university pushes. I said, you're kidding me. By the time this actually gets through review and actually gets published, the crisis or the situation I'm writing about is dead. I mean,
your field is no different in that respect.
Yeah.
I'm used to 2-year delays. This is the norm in journals. It's better now that many of them are online, so the production delay is not as bad. You're not waiting for a printer. But,
Well, for a paleontologist, I mean,
Yeah.
that's, what the heck? That's a true.
I published a paper, and my first paper ever was in Nature, and it was about some specimens of Jurassic mammals found in the famous dinosaur locality in Como, Wyoming. And it had been found a decade earlier by some of my predecessors in the graduate program and then never published. So when I got around to writing it up, one of the things the editor of Nature asked me is, this paper is from 10 years of research ago. Why is it so late? And I said, oh, that's fast by paleo standards. So our things aren't going anywhere. They're all dead.
Next question.
So how would you recommend that researchers take probably bullshit, maybe valid, maybe invalid, alternate theories to their own into account in literature reviews and in papers without forming a bias?
I mean, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but it sounds like you're saying that how should a researcher address an unscientific aspect of their paper without sound like they're biased against it? Yeah. So it's an interesting question, and the question of bias in research in that respect is a little tricky, because it's not as if researchers don't have an idea about what is likely to be true or what's not true. It's not that we have to pretend like we don't have very strong feelings about what the correct answer is, or what's real and what's nonsense. It's that you conduct the protocol in such a way that it doesn't matter. It's not that you don't have preconceptions, it's that your preconceptions should not influence the data. There's no way to completely factor out your preconceived notions or your biases from your discussion and evaluation, like your conclusions.
As a peer review does.
Yeah, that's what the crowdsourcing is for, right? Because no individual is going to have a perfectly unbiased filter or lens. You have to get multiple eyes on it, and so as long as you're going, that process is there for that reason. So as long as you're going through that process transparently, that's where the transparency also comes in, then I think it's fine. It's okay. And in reality, researchers are brutal with each other. They're absolutely brutal. It's not like, I mean, they could still be friends and be in handshake, but like behind the scenes, like, that guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's completely wrong.
Yeah.
That's your best person to give your paper to.
Yeah.
Right. No, totally.
Oh, yeah. The editors try that too. So
I mean, just behind the scenes, like what people like my fellow physicians say about each other, it's all good. But I mean, damn, they do not pull their punches when it comes to stuff like that. Like, it's not like no one's pretending not to have strong feelings about these kinds of things.
I also, at least for me, I find myself trapped by my own data.
Yeah.
Right? The way you collect data, the way you put it in, and the questions come up. Well, Nick, is this a surge in the numbers of activity going, or a surge in law enforcement? Addressing the issue, because it gives you a different perspective either way. So you do bring in bias, whether you like it or not, just based on the way you capture and collect and utilize data. I try and get that out in the open, because if you say transparently, look, this is, and just unintentionally, look, this is the way I catalog my data. This is the result of it, and people then can say, okay, I see what this is. Maybe they're a little less brutal, at least, but it's important that everyone has, as you pointed out, that kind of level playing field and understanding in communication.
And from a consumer standpoint, something that was touched on briefly earlier, look at the metadata, right? Because the way I test something may be different than how Nick tests it. And we might, have 50 people have tested differently, and then you look at this done over years, you may get metadata on a particular subject with 200 different studies. So we're not likely to have 200 people biased the exact same way. So you're going to get a better understanding of the literature by looking at the metadata. So that's always helpful.
And also always look for the contrary opinion, right? Like, I don't believe something until I've read the arguments of those people who don't believe it. Yeah. Right? Who does not accept this position? What do they have to say? Do they have anything good to say, or are they when then I come to a conclusion when I realize who has sort of the best final argument in the exchange. That's kind of when you get a sense of who's probably right. Until you've read the other side, though, you have no idea. Any argument could be made to sound fantastic if you're only hearing one side of it. You always got to seek out the data that is against whatever you think is true.
And they could be both be wrong.
Yeah, they both could be right. Absolutely.
I've seen that.
Be some other third thing.
Hello.
I'm rather interested in the role that science is going to have with this constant need for information. And I'm really interested to see what you feel about the fact that there's kind of a rise in either pseudoscientists or other professionals who or professors who have their own pages who will instantly put out a tweet or a video or something like that based on a topic way before we've gone through the scientific method and the process to get the information there. And that will gain millions upon millions of views and traction. What do you kind of do in a situation like that to either sell science better as a thing that you can either wait and see, or do you go out and meet that person and say your own response, say like, hey, you didn't do the science, you didn't have enough time, you shouldn't be saying that? Like, how do you do that in those situations?
Anyone?
I don't.
I mean, there's definitely, we're living in an environment now where the information gets out there before it gets peer reviewed, and there's good and bad things to that. There are preprint servers that were put up by scientists so that they can communicate to each other. In fact, because they don't have to wait 2 years to hear what they're saying, right? Because the peer review process could be so long. It's like, I'm just going to put it out there now. It's not peer reviewed yet, but just so that you guys know what's happening and you could take that into consideration with your own research. And also you guys could pick it apart and maybe make it better even before it gets to the peer review process. So that's all good. The problem is that the media runs with it without realizing the difference between a preprint and a peer reviewed, or without realizing the difference between a preliminary study and a consensus study. Like, there's a huge spectrum out there. And the media just sees, is that an exciting headline? Great, let's go with it, without putting it into any kind of context. And so whose job is it to put it into context? Science journalists, science communicators. That's their job.
Of which there are fewer now.
Yeah.
So.
Well, of which there are, I think there's more science communicators, and there's fewer science journalists. There's
journalists who know the science.
Yeah,
that's right.
Which is terrible, because the print journals and the mainstream journals don't have the money to support multiple subspecialty journalists, so they have generalist journalists now doing science journalism, and it totally matters. It 100% matters. But science communicators are trying to fill the gap, and that's the good part of all this, right? Because now you can have scientists who happen to be really good at communication, who can have a popular blog or YouTube channel or TikTok or whatever, giving really good information. There's a ton of great science communicators out there, but unfortunately, they're just mixed in with all the really terrible communicators, or they're just the pseudoscientists who are taking advantage. They're just the opportunistic journalists who can't tell the difference between a piece of crap preliminary study and this is probably true definitive study. So and there's no filter anymore. So it's you have to be discerning.
So
that's it.
As a scientist who's both a science communicator and a publishing scientist, it's a challenge. I mean, it takes a lot of time to do something other than what you're supposed to be doing, which is your primary research. But for many years, I had a page on Skeptic blog where I blog every week about a scientific topic usually, and I've written a lot of those things in books that I've read, written and had wide circulation, and put a YouTube channel together right now for some stuff that I work on. But that's something I really care about, so I'm putting my personal time into stuff that doesn't affect my academic standing or anything like that. It's just doing it because I really believe the public should have someone who knows what they're talking about once in a while, talking about these things. And so that's something I really take seriously, which is why I write and I blog and everything else.
Actually, just to throw out a thought for you guys, I'm sure you do this, but before you do publication, before you put anything out, do you bring it to a circle of people and say, hey, kill this thing? Look at that. I mean, being a product of the world I am, I'm actually very used to that, because you have 14 layers above you who are all going to, you're lying, you're wrong, you're this, you're that, and you just divorce yourself from the work the minute you write it, because everyone's just going to slice it and slam it apart. We used to have a phrase: what goes up must come down 16 times for a rewrite, and that's because it gets such review. And I do that now in anything I put out. I just say just brutalize it. And because at the end of the day, when it becomes public, I want it to be the best work it can possibly be. So for me, rooting out my bias, rooting out the way I do it, that's the way I start with it. I'll let people point that out, and lets me self-correct.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on what it is. You know, my daily blog, I don't have time for
No, of course.
peer review, but so there are topics where like, I'm not really ready to write about this, or I have to check in with experts and
Right.
and see, put it through some kind of process, or like on science-based medicine, we check in with each other, on certain issues. But then also sometimes I think, well, I'll just do it in real time. Like I'll just write it and say, this is my thought on the process, but I don't really know what the answer is. You tell me what you think, and then I'll correct it with a follow-up and just show the process, because there's no definitive answer ever. It's always just what process are you going through. So I think sometimes it's good to show the process of this is how I work my way through it, and I just try to get less and less wrong as I go along, and that's fine.
Yeah. So we've got about 4 minutes left. Time for a couple more questions.
Cool. Hi, I'm Dan. I'm an infectious disease physician. This is something I've run into a few times. I wanted to see what the panel thinks about it, or if you've had to deal with this. What happens when people who are promoting pseudoscience are people that you work with or are dependent on? So in my case, I've had a physician in my group that kind of promotes pseudoscience. I've had people that refer to me that sell BS, like antifungal treatments, and a more broad example, like the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, which I learned just went out of business, that was combining, it was a for-profit cancer treatment center that was promoting like acupuncture and scam medical things that went with chemotherapy. What do you do when those things all refer back to you, that like your livelihood is also based on people who are promoting scams?
Well, I know when I was working up in Cleveland, the chiropractors were trying to get hospital privileges, and since I'm emergency physician, we're sort of even though we're the front door of the hospital now, they still treat us like itinerant workers, and so I'm kind of an internal locum, so I sort of am, but at the same time, we just don't, as individual physicians, sometimes have the clout. I mean, if you're on the board, it's helpful, but even you had the resistance.
Yeah, so first of all, what do I do? It's no secret what my opinion is about all of this, right? So because I'm out there on social media, I don't have to like hide my opinion. Everyone knows I'm uber skeptic when it comes to these things. They come to me and say, "Oh, what does the skeptic think about this?" So it's kind of already baked in. But if you're not in that position, it's your career. You have to decide what you're willing to do, and what you want to do. My approach and what I usually recommend is just be honest. Just say, listen, I'm coming from a scientific perspective. So I'm in that position with patients more, because patients don't necessarily know my life outside of just being their doctor. And they will ask, should I get acupuncture for this, or should I try this homeopathic remedy, or do I need to worry about vaccines, or whatever it is? And I just tell them exactly what I think. I don't sugarcoat it at all, but I frame it as, well, this I looked at the scientific literature. This is what I think the scientific literature says. This is why I think it says it, and that's it. I'm just putting out the science. I'm a science-based practitioner, unapologetically, and I put it out there. Same thing, and I've done this. I have given this feedback up the chain at my university. It's like, I personally wouldn't have a seminar on homeopathy because it's pseudoscience, and really we shouldn't be putting the Yale and Primature on pseudoscience. And they accept, they may not like, some people may not like it, but fuck them. They accept it, because what could they say? I'm telling you what the science says, and aren't we supposed to be doing that? And then usually it works. I've never really had it backfire on me. I think you're probably more afraid than you need to be. I think as long as you really believe what you're saying, you're probably okay.
And I have used, I can't even tell you how many times I've used science-based medicine, not only for my patients, but also for my nursing staff, who also has, my other ancillary healthcare workers that I work with. They really just don't have the training. I mean, Reiki is a really very common teaching in nursing schools, and so they're getting pseudoscience in from both ends, not only from the public and from their friends, but also from the actual nursing schools. And it's so hard to combat that. Yeah. It really is. So, Kathy, I'm so sorry. We got 48 seconds left.
It's going to be really quick.
What's up?
Thank you all for the academic work that you do. And where is the Department of Education from a university here? And how do you guys, we've been talking about this K-12 world where we want kids to think more critically. How can you guys help, or can you help influence that university environment where they're teaching teachers how to teach.
I give a seminar to science teachers getting their degree in science education because I was invited to do so at a specific university near where I live. So, you know, I'm not in a department of education. We kind of have to be invited to do that. We could try to insert ourselves, but you know that usually that doesn't work.
A lot of turf wars there.
Yeah.
I've been invited. I've participated in a couple of Department of Energy workshops. I'm not giving any opinion other than myself, but they seem to be pretty much flat on their back. I mean, I just don't know how to.
I don't know
how else
what
to
that
phrase
means.
it.
What does that mean?
That means they were incapable of executing the mission that they have been chartered to do. They're incapable of even obeying the law that and you know managing the legal framework that they're given in their relationship to universities. They just don't get anything done. I mean, it's just I don't know how to do it. You know, great they hosted a couple of workshops, but I don't know. It just didn't. Nothing ever happens with them.
I didn't know that euphemism. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, well, we're out of town. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this panel. Thank you for my panelists. Really very much appreciated. Oh, DragonCon 2023. We'll see you soon. Thanks.